Anyone who has been to enough family funerals knows this. The hardest moment is usually not when people are crying the loudest. It is when everything still looks normal, the table is still set, the tea is still warm, the curtains are still moving in the breeze. People are still talking about ordinary things, like the weather tomorrow, whether the children should go out, where everyone will sit at dinner. And yet you can already feel that something has gone missing. More precisely, someone has gone missing. The person who used to hold the whole house together is no longer fully there. They are already beginning to turn from a person into a memory. That is exactly what makes To the Lighthouse so powerful, and honestly, so unsettling. On the surface, it is a novel about whether a family will go to the lighthouse, and then, years later, finally going to the lighthouse. That sounds almost suspiciously simple. If you explained the plot like that to the wrong person today, they would probably say, "Wait, that is it? People stare out of windows, think very hard, and then eventually get on a boat?" But once you actually read it, you realize this is not a simple family outing story at all. It feels like a family funeral from beginning to end. Not a dramatic funeral with shouting and fainting and last-minute revelations, more like the kind of grief that settles into the furniture. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. In this video, I want to look at 3 questions. What is To the Lighthouse actually about? Why does it feel so much like a family funeral? And why did Virginia Woolf choose to write memory, grief, motherhood, fatherhood, and the collapse of an entire domestic world in exactly this form? By the end, I want to suggest something a little sharper. This novel is not just mourning one woman, it is mourning an entire idea of family. The simple plot. Before anything else, we should make the novel itself clear. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 and died in 1941. She is one of the central figures of literary modernism in Britain. If you take any serious tour through 20th century literature, her name appears alongside James Joyce, Marcel Proust, T.S. Eliot, and Catherine Mansfield. She belongs to that generation of writers who no longer believed that the old Victorian way of telling stories could fully explain modern life. And that historical context matters. 19th century fiction often gave readers a stable world. Even when there was tragedy, the social structure was still visible. In Jane Austen, marriage, class, and manners form a recognizable pattern. In Charles Dickens, even chaos has a social map. In George Eliot, moral choices still unfold in a world that feels legible. But by the early 20th century, especially around and after the First World War, that confidence had cracked. The world no longer felt whole. Consciousness itself became unstable material. That is where modernism comes in. Woolf published To the Lighthouse in 1927. The novel is divided into 3 parts: The Window, Time Passes, and The Lighthouse. In the first part, the Ramsay family and their guests are spending time at their summer house by the sea. Young James Ramsay desperately wants to go to the lighthouse the next day. His mother, Mrs. Ramsay, gently encourages that hope. His father, Mr. Ramsay, immediately says the weather will not be good enough, so no, they will not be going. That sounds tiny, almost embarrassingly tiny, but the whole emotional structure of the novel is already there. For James, it is not just about a boat trip. It is about whether hope will be protected or crushed. For Mrs. Ramsay, it is about her instinct to preserve feeling, to soften the world, to keep emotional life alive. For Mr. Ramsay, it is about fact, truth, rationality, and authority. So this little scene becomes a whole family drama in miniature. Then the novel changes shape. In the middle section, time moves forward with shocking speed. The house decays, war happens, people die. Mrs. Ramsay dies, Prue dies, Andrew dies. And then, in the final section, years later, Mr. Ramsay finally sails to the lighthouse with James and Cam, while Lily Briscoe, the painter, remains on shore and at last completes the painting she had long struggled to finish. So yes, the plot is simple. One day they do not go, many years pass, then finally they do. But that is only the skeleton. The real novel is about what happens when time hollows out a family from within. Mrs. Ramsay. If this novel feels like a funeral, the first reason is Mrs. Ramsay. She is the emotional center of the book, but in a very strange way. She does not dominate by action. She is not a heroine in the old sense. She does not go on adventures, make grand speeches, or perform dramatic plot-turning decisions. Instead, she does the invisible work that makes a household feel like a world. She comforts children. She manages dinner. She stabilizes guests. She protects fragile moods. She helps people feel connected to one another, sometimes even when they are not. And that, of course, is exactly why her importance is so easy to miss at first, because the labor she performs is emotional, social, and domestic. It is the kind of labor that makes everything else seem natural, until it disappears. That is one of Woolf's great insights. A family often looks stable not because it is naturally harmonious, but because someone is constantly stitching its torn edges back together. Someone is absorbing the strain. Someone is quietly doing maintenance on the emotional architecture. In this novel, that person is Mrs. Ramsay. What makes Woolf especially brilliant is that she does not write Mrs. Ramsay as a simple saint. She is warm, generous, intuitive, and deeply loved. But she also belongs to an older order. She believes in marriage. She believes women should be placed within domestic life. She sees Lily Briscoe, unmarried and committed to painting, as somehow lacking a proper future. So even as the novel mourns her, it also examines her. It loves her and questions her at the same time. That is one reason I find Woolf so compelling. She never gives you clean emotional instructions. She does not tell you whom to worship. She lets love and criticism exist in the same room. Mrs. Ramsay is both a source of light and part of the system that traps women inside the role of being light for others. This is where the novel starts to feel like a funeral, even before anyone dies. Mrs. Ramsay is still alive in the first section, but everyone is already looking at her in a way that feels almost memorial. They admire her, need her, misread her, depend on her, orbit around her. She is both present and already becoming an image in other people's minds. That is what funerals do. They turn a person into a shape that the living can carry. The empty house. Then comes the middle section, and this is where Woolf does something extraordinary. Normally, novels treat death as an event. There is a scene. There is emphasis. The text tells you, pay attention, this matters. Woolf does almost the opposite. In Time Passes, the house becomes the main witness. Darkness moves through the rooms. Wind presses at the windows. Dust gathers. Silence expands. Human life withdraws, and in that withdrawal, death is announced almost casually. This is devastating because it feels true. In real grief, the most painful thing is often not the announcement itself, it is the empty place. The chair no one sits in anymore. The staircase no one comes down. The room that still seems to expect someone. Woolf understands that loss is often registered spatially before it is fully registered emotionally. And this is where historical context matters again. Woolf was writing in the aftermath of the First World War, a disaster that shattered European confidence in progress, empire, reason, and stable civilization. That war did not just kill millions of people. It also damaged the old narrative frameworks people had used to make sense of life. Writers like Proust, Joyce, Eliot, and Woolf all responded in different ways. Proust, In Search of Lost Time, turns memory into an immense inward universe. Joyce, in Ulysses, turns a single day in Dublin into a labyrinth of consciousness. Eliot, in The Wasteland, gives us a broken civilization, speaking through fragments. Woolf does something quieter, but no less radical. She shows how time invades the home. She shows how history enters domestic life not always through speeches and headlines, but through absence, interruption, and the slow ruin of continuity. That is why Time Passes feels less like a chapter and more like a vigil. The house keeps existing, but the life inside it has been punctured. Furniture remains, walls remain, habits almost remain. But the person who made the whole structure feel inhabited is gone. And this is why I think the funeral mood in To the Lighthouse is so intense. Woolf is not interested in grief as performance. She is interested in grief as atmosphere. Woolf's family. At this point, we have to bring Woolf herself into the picture, because without her life, the emotional force of this novel becomes flatter. Virginia Woolf grew up in a highly cultured household. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a writer, critic, and editor. Her mother, Julia Stephen, was admired for her beauty, her care for others, and her remarkable social presence. From the outside, this looked like an ideal intellectual Victorian family, but those families were often more fragile than they appeared. Julia Stephen died when Woolf was 13. That loss marked her for life. Later, her father died as well. These bereavements were not just biographical facts, they became part of the emotional structure of her imagination. And To the Lighthouse is one of the clearest places where that personal history enters fiction. Mrs. Ramsay is widely understood to be shaped by Julia Stephen. Mr. Ramsay clearly carries traits associated with Leslie Stephen. The summer house by the sea recalls Woolf's own childhood memories of St. Ives in Cornwall. Even the lighthouse itself comes out of that remembered landscape. But what matters most is not simply that Woolf borrowed from life. Writers do that all the time. What matters is what she did with those materials. She did not just recreate her parents. She transformed them into a meditation on memory, gender, authority, and grief. She writes the mother as beloved, but not simple. She writes the father as intellectually powerful, but emotionally demanding. She writes the household as full of intimacy, but also full of pressure. In other words, she is not writing nostalgia, she is writing an autopsy of family life. This links To the Lighthouse to another of Woolf's major works, A Room of One's Own. In that book, she argues that a woman needs money and a room of her own if she is to write. That argument did not come from nowhere. It came from a deep understanding that domestic life, however beautiful it may appear, often absorbs women so completely that their own interior freedom becomes almost impossible to sustain. So when Woolf writes Mrs. Ramsay, she is not only mourning her mother, she is also examining the cost of becoming the kind of woman everyone else needs. Lily's vision. By the final section, the journey to the lighthouse no longer feels like a childhood excursion, it feels like an overdue ritual. James finally goes, but he does not go as the little boy we first met. He goes as someone shaped by years of resentment, longing, and unfinished feeling. The lighthouse is no longer just a destination. It is something like a reckoning, a place where an old emotional wound is finally approached, even if it is never fully healed. At the same time, Lily Briscoe completes her painting. This matters just as much as the boat trip. In some ways, it matters more. Because Lily's struggle is not only artistic, it is existential. She is trying to find a form for what has been lost. She is trying to see clearly after the center has disappeared. And that, I think, is the final answer to why this novel feels like a funeral. A funeral is not only about burying the dead. It is about trying to arrange memory into a form the living can endure. It is about giving shape to what can no longer be possessed. That is what Lily's painting does, and that is what Woolf's novel itself does. Art, in Woolf's hands, does not bring people back. It does not restore the family to wholeness. It does not pretend that grief can be solved. What it can do is hold loss long enough for us to see its structure. It can give absence a contour. It can let memory exist without turning it into sentimentality. And that is why To the Lighthouse goes beyond being a novel about one family. It becomes a novel about modern consciousness itself. About how we live after the old certainties have weakened. About how we remember people we loved without lying about the pain they caused, or the systems they upheld, or the parts of them we could never fully know. That is also why this is one of my personal favorite novels by Woolf. She does not tell you what to feel. She lets you walk through the house, notice the empty chair, watch the light shift on the wall, and then, almost before you realize it, you understand that the whole book has been teaching you how grief changes a space. In the end, the lighthouse itself is almost indifferent. It does not save anyone. It does not explain anything. It simply remains there, as families gather and fracture, as mothers become memories, as children grow into adults carrying old weather inside them. The lighthouse is not the answer, it is the witness. That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and see you at the next lighthouse.